Are you feeling lost and oftentimes wonder, will anyone ever find me in this dark place? I feel you, I see you, I was there until I found Jesus and His grace. Welcome to the If It's Just One podcast. I'm your host, Stashani Atkins. I must admit I don't have it all together, but I believe with a little encouragement we will make it to heaven together. We oftentimes underestimate the power of one, but Jesus left the 99 for one. And so, if this podcast only reaches one person, that's all that matters. This podcast will be focused on encouraging you, my brothers and sisters, to rise above the challenges that prevent us from being who God has called us to be. Stay tuned. We really need each other. Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode. This episode is entitled The Temptation to Return to What is Familiar. Have you ever been in a situation where you find yourself wanting to go back to a place of familiarity? A place that you have left because it had nothing good to offer you, but somehow you're thinking about returning to that place. Crazy, right? Most, if not all of us, have felt this way at one point or another. Even as Christians, we might be tempted to return to the familiar. We might be faced with opportunities to return to what's comfortable and familiar, and that is to the way we lived before we knew Jesus. But of course, that is the plan of the enemy to lead us away from the life we were called by God to live. Sometimes the familiar can be more comforting than the uncertainty of what will happen after we let go and jump into the unknown. But we have to ask ourselves, what do we value more, comfort or growth? And sometimes the familiar is so toxic that we are being consumed by the toxicity, and there comes a time when we have to ask ourselves, what do we have to lose if we change, if we let go of the familiar? And for most of us, that answer is nothing, because all the familiar is doing is killing us. We're suffocating there. We can hardly breathe there. We can't grow there. And so if we stay there, all we're gonna do is die, whether physically, spiritually, or emotionally. And so there's nothing to lose when we let go of the familiar. You might be saying, but we can die in the unknown too. Well, you can live as well. And so it's better you go where you have a choice, which is to die or live, rather than staying where there is no choice but to die. Sometimes God is calling us to leave the familiar because we can't be who He has called us to be there, and we can't do what He has called us to do there. Sometimes we even cry out to God from the familiar, and He has seen the bondage we're in. He has seen the tears we have cried. He has seen how the familiar is destroying us day by day, and so He has called us to something better, to something great. But when it seems like great or better is not coming, we might choose to return to the familiar because it's all we know and we're comfortable there. We have history with the familiar. The danger that is associated with returning to the familiar where we find comfort is that it oftentimes slows down the progression of peace, joy, and righteousness. It oftentimes leads us back to some form of bondage, and there's always consequences when we return to the familiar because the promise of the new is taking too long. In the book of Exodus in the Bible, there's a story of Moses leading the people of God out of the bondage in Egypt. Many times on the journey to freedom, the people would complain to Moses that he and God has brought them out so they could die. Every time they encountered difficulty, their fear would cause them to want to go back to the familiar. And like the Israelites, sometimes our fear reminds us of the familiar, and we would rather go back to the old way of living, even though we were in bondage. But it was a bondage we had grown comfortable with. While the Israelites were in Egypt for many years, they learned of Egypt's worship and the customs, and without having a godly leader for many years, they would have likely found themselves worshipping the gods of Egypt. And so when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, where he would receive the 10 Commandments from God, the people were supposed to be under the care of Aaron, which was Moses' brother. But the people began to rebel against God and asked Aaron to make a god that they could worship, and Aaron made a golden calf. God has brought them so far, and they still had the familiar in mind. This time they didn't want to return to the familiar, but they brought the familiar to them. And so, like the Israelites, sometimes it's too easy for us to forget the acts of God in our lives that have brought us out of our own personal Egypt, that place of bondage, causing us to return to our previous lifestyles. When we have come to the saving knowledge of God through faith in Jesus, we will be required to give up an old way of living and begin a new one, and that life means not returning to the previous one. Jesus said to deny yourself, pick up your cross daily and follow him. It was so easy for the Israelites to return to worshipping other gods when they saw that Moses did not return and they didn't know what happened. Their faith was in the man of God and not God himself, because they were quick to return to worshipping something in place of the true and living God. And like the Israelites, sometimes God may use someone to help us out of the familiar, and we start depending on that person more than we depend on God. And when we encounter difficult times and that person is not around, we are tempted to go back to the familiar or bring the familiar to us. And there is a real danger of people committing the sin of idolatry by putting a man or woman in the place of God. It was not really Moses who brought the people out of Egypt. It was God, but he did it through Moses. And so if Moses was not there, they could have turned to God, who is always present. And so if there is anyone listening and you are in a difficult situation and you feel all alone, do not return to the familiar, but turn to God, talk to him. He's always present. He's the one who can help you. Today, if you feel tempted to return to the familiar, I encourage you to remember the reason why you left. Remember why you cried out to God to save you from the familiar. And if you are in the familiar right now and you feel like it's doing more damage than good, but you are afraid to step out because the familiar is all you know, I implore you to turn to God, to cry out to him. He's not too busy to hear your heart cry. He is willing to deliver you from your Egypt, but first you have to want to be delivered. Invite him into your life today, because he has already left the 99 to free you from the familiar and to prevent you from returning. So, if you have a testimony of how God has freed you from the familiar and the desire to return, please feel free to share in the comment section. If this episode has encouraged you, please like and subscribe and share with someone you think it will encourage. See you in the next episode, and remember, we need Jesus and we need each other.